I think it's in kilter. I suspect that an international phenomenon is that we all think the umpires are wrong all the time.
Internationally.
Yep.
So it's not just
every fan base is the same.
I mean, even this talk about 4 umpires, go for it. You guys live this, you breathe it. Your job, you know that your job is to execute the rules as they're written, and there's a lot of grey in every rule book, and there's a lot of competitors, players and coaches that are trying to find that grey area and milk it for a competitive advantage for all it's worth. So you are the judge, jury and executioner. You are the people that are in charge with officiating the game. We trust you to do it as best you can. If you think 4 umpires is needed to do that, then do it. Go for it. There's no debate for me. You make the calls, be invisible, get it done. I just can't believe how much focus we put on this stuff. Just let them do their job. They're not going to be perfect. Why do we expect people to be perfect? No one is.
Do you like the idea of the transparency at the end of it, or are you unfazed by it?
No, I believe that I love it when Razor used to come in here. I don't think we give our – I know maybe they want to be creating characters or personalities through that, but I think it humanises people when you hear from them, when you give them the chance to give voice to – the nuance in the decision making. I think that by not allowing that, we create a bigger chasm between what we see in our officiating group and what we want to see. I think more communication is better.
Yep. Rather
than what we have seen.
All right, so we both watched Show Me the Money too.
Yep.
I heard you speaking to Kane yesterday around this is the era of the behind the scenes of sport documentary. This is the second iteration of the trade period. We would both come at this differently. You've lived these experiences. Most of us the voyeurism as we look in. What struck you when you watched it?
The reinforcement to me was how powerful the managers are in those situations, because largely there is a voyeurism from one out, one back. I mean, even the senior coach who's looking for immediate success. He's looking for now. There's a list manager role that he's front and centre. And then with the recruiting team, understanding what their picks are and working out that, in front of a list management panel but when the cut and thrust is there, it's the list manager with the managers. So their relationships are crucial. Obviously the manager's relationship with their players. And at that point, a player and a club could not be further apart, even though they're still on the list. And then all of a sudden you go, all of the reasons if a club wants to move a player on or feels like they're trying to get value for a player, they're simultaneously happy to let him go, but then valuing him for his strengths, but then saying that we want to move on, we need to move on from you here. So you're trying to say he's valuable, but we don't want him. It's a very different scenario, very different situation. And when there is emotion and connection that is involved, as we saw with all the players, there's a feeling of a breakup of a relationship and a disconnect that takes place, that has to take place for the trade to occur.
Couple of the aspects for me around the managers. So the first was just how hands-on they are in brokering a trade.
Yes.
So sometimes where the list managers couldn't find a chord, what we would see was the manager step in and actually confirm a deal.
Yes.
I've got this deal done. You ring him. This is what's going to happen.
And we saw that with Paul Connors and with Colin Young for their respective players at different times in that show.
So whether you'd call it sort of brokering or strong-arming, whatever it was sometimes it was the manager who broke the impasse between the two teams. I thought it was so interesting that the Connors group had their own trade corporate breakfast for the behind-the-scenes look at it. Like they're the central players in it, and they've got a breakfast at which some of the list managers are there.
Yeah.
I was oblivious to that.
Well, and I didn't realise that Robbie D'Orazio had so many brothers, and their brothers in list manager roles. It's clearly, it's laid bare about how important relationships are to get things done. So, and list managers, player managers are looking for win-wins for the players, And the list managers have got the club's interests at heart, and the fact that it is a team sport, it's not individual sport. And sometimes you need to sacrifice one to make the better decision for the whole, based on, the experiences and the knowledge of the leadership of the day. And you don't always get that right, but you're representing the club, and then the manager. Someone needs to stand there for the player and stand for the player, and the managers do that absolutely.
And then the glimpse into the relationships. So I thought Rory Lobbs was illuminating. He tried to leave Fremantle the previous year. He stayed. He actually probably had his best season of footy, but there was an estrangement, he felt, from the coach.
Yeah, well, I think we need to strip that back. I think it stems from the fact that they think I didn't want to be there. Well, asking for a trade only months earlier is probably going to lend people to think that you don't want to be there. So, let's call that out. And secondly, I mean, in the end, a player, if he wants to leave, he will be less engaged in some shape or form, or he will be more interested in his own performance to feather his nest and to improve his chances of looking attractive to other clubs. So, and Roy Lobbett achieved all of that because he had probably had a career best back half of the year last year, ironically. So I think in some way, whenever a player or a club chooses to move on from the relationship that they've shared and the promise of a future that is potentially no longer going to occur, it's no different to a romantic relationship. There is going to be some pain and trauma that occurs with it. The pragmatic aspect and professional aspect of the club or of the game, I think when 18-year-olds go into it, I think their managers already know exactly how it's going to play out. But I think at some point we lose the romanticism of playing AFL footy, and that you realise it's a business. I reckon at a stage of maybe your first contract, your second contract, the first time you might be on the cusp, you might feel like I'm not as loved as I wanted to be or need to be. And they are all experiences that you have to go through to live a full life in this caper.
So how does a coach mete out his attention and maybe to a degree even his affection across a player group, across the demands of a season? So there's the famous story of Lee Matthews is once you weren't playing, Lee had no time for you. Not as a person, but there was just too much else to do. Once you're injured, you're out of his focus. And once you were back in as an asset, then your attention. How much of a tussle is it to stay connected with everybody that you want to and need to?
I think it is the primary role of the senior coach, because in the end, once you've set your plans on how you want to go about it for a season, well, then a lot of that work is picked up by the line coaches and the senior leaders in the playing group as much as the guiding sort of hand of a senior coach. The reason that the senior coach's role is delineated from a list manager's role is because the senior coach needs to worry about this week and putting this squad together to improve its capacity to win now and and in the medium term. The list manager there is looking at medium to long term, and he's got to lift his eyes and project beyond the minutiae of the day, and the senior coach is allowed then to just go and focus on the group that he has in front of him right now. And that delineation is required so that a club can have competing interests between now and later. Like you've got to be able to collaborate in those aspects. But a senior coach absolutely needs to maintain connection with every element of the football program, and largely on a connection basis, primarily before you can even look at getting the best out of your people.
And would you need to do that in a structured way? Like, would you have to make time to make sure you'd spoken to everybody, or?
I think, well, I once, was given a piece of advice to have a playlist there and put a dot, when you've had a conversation, put a dot next to that name and make sure that you're sort of trying to knock that list over in a 2-week period.
Okay.
You'd love to think that you could do it every day, but it's not possible. You've got 45 players there. You've got another 70 staff. So you've got 120 people. And because you're the senior coach, because you're pushed up, you sort of put on that, you're seen as the main guy in the footy program, even though you've got the director of football above you, even though you've got the head of conditioning who has more contact hours with the players than anyone, even though you've got physios and doctors that the players probably spend more downtime around the physio and the masseur, unpacking stuff. You've got an hour on the table. Like their conversations are deep and intense,
Yep.
so they have great influence on a player. But the senior coach is the guy, right? So everyone wants to not be in his good books or garner favour or have a connection with. It takes a lot of time. So to have the setup where you've got roles and responsibilities and trusts and jobs associated across the football program to basically allow the senior coach to go where he needs to go to connect with the people within the organisation. And sometimes there's a disconnect.
Yep.
And that's potentially where more time and energy needs to be spent. Rory Lobb with Justin Longmuir, it doesn't mean that they both weren't connected at different points, but it was looking like it was going to move, so it changed.
Yep.
Brodie Grundy and Craig McRae came through that one, and Jack Bowes, we didn't even hear about what Stuart Dew thought about him. We didn't hear from the Gold Coast aspect of that at all, just that Jack Bowes and pick 7 was up, and where are you going to go?
And that equation that it was finally good for him to hear what he could do for 3 clubs than what he couldn't do, which was, at least to some degree, what was occupying their minds.
Yeah, and at one point
squeezed out.
And at one point, Gold Coast were doing exactly the same to try and get the best out. But when it's gone, it's gone. And when the club believes that the team's immediate interests or future interests and the club's future interests are served better by letting this relationship go, they're hard conversations and they're tough decisions.
The other aspect, so I know you've been asked to comment a lot around Brodie Grundy, so I'm not going to repeat any of that. But the most fascinating aspect to me, and I'm a doubter on whether the 2 best ruckmen will work in the same team, because I think it will simply reduce each's output. They won't quite be the player that they would be on their own in the ruck. The most interesting aspect I thought of A Glimpse of Things to Come was the relaying of the conversation, the pitch that was made by Gawn to Grundy, that Gawn was going to play 30% in the ruck and 70% forward.
Well, and I don't know whether you could get a Brodie Grundy over the line to you unless you made that assertion. He needs to know that he's not just coming as a key forward. So that's why it's so fascinating to see how that actually settles, because you're not going to do that if it doesn't work. Simon Goodwin and the coaching staff have the right and the responsibility to actually set their team up the way it's going to best perform. And if it doesn't best perform that way, well, then it's going to shift. And Brodie needs to understand that, and so does Max. So does every player. You sign on to do whatever is asked for the best of the betterment of the team.
So do you think Gawn is a 70% forward, potentially?
Well, we've seen Gawn work with Jackson. And we saw in the 21, towards the end of 21, how Gawn felt that Jackson was better himself. We hear that he, selflessly thought that Jackson, here, you need to be the main man here and I'll go forward. And that was over time that the mantle was sort of passed on in some ways, or at least part of it was, and the number 1 ruck role was shared. I find that most number 1 ruckmen see themselves as number 1 ruckman, and a number 1 ruckman feels like they can go from first bounce to the end, because it's not a game really based on speed and transition. It's a grinding, aggressive, clearance, stoppage by stoppage, marking contest by marking contest. It's a grind, and the Nan Curvises. I think Pitney is a modern day sort of combative player. I think Brodie Grundy is, and I think Max Gawn is. So it'd be really interesting how the psyche of those individuals that want to be the number 1 guy, how they feel being 1.5, because that's what they're both going to be asked to do.
It'll be, I think it's the most interesting team dynamic of the season to see how they manage it, how they set it up. But less than that, it's about how do they get the best result for each player.
Yeah.
And that's why, that saying in America, if you've got two quarterbacks, you've got no quarterbacks. So you are naturally diminishing the two best ruckmen in the competition by sheer virtue of they can't play in the ruck at the same time.
Well, so if you extrapolate it out, and Melbourne have obviously made this. We've got to understand that you still need depth in role. And so one of the things that came out is we've got Gawn, we've got Grundy, and then nothing. So there is no other ruckman on their list. They believe no one capable of playing senior footy at that role. So at this point, so they're skinny in some ways, but fat in the commitment to those two players in terms of what they've committed out of their salary cap. I assume. Having said that, you look at Melbourne side of it, you're getting an A-grade player in Brodie Grundy probably for 2/3 of his market worth. The same way that Collingwood must be getting Tom Mitchell for probably less than half of his market worth. So he becomes, Tom Mitchell becomes far more of a value proposition to Collingwood than he would if he stayed at Hawthorn, and same for Melbourne than if he stayed at Collingwood. So we don't see that commerciality or that measure because it's under the surface, but it is a part of the decision making that takes place.